am just waiting to see Chelsea ni PSG. Say PSG a defending champion of the Champions League. No me defend here. And Chelsea kwachi omo Club World Cup. Etia omo. Chelsea kachire say Champions League na PSG no. Because omo mo bi dira. Because omo be chi omo Club World Cup no. Omo di omo level. And you know me help PSG for say omo quite wounded. The way Chelsea here omo hojuma our Club World Cup no. Chairman PSG for come like a wounded lion. And don't forget last year and last season Champions League on Beji no. From start stage way and on Beji Champions League no. Because on one no automatic air qualification. On bo playoff. And on the playoff no. And then Musa and a bit Beji Champions League no. So that is one big game one. Chairman, I can't just wait to see Chelsea any PSG game no. Luis Enrique so kind. See a draw now. The Obo Empire and say Obo first leg no fee. Team yoni be shebiano either Barcelona and as Chelsea and that team biana or no ebenyano no name
nothing to lose. Omo team are there for where they have gotten to already. It's a huge achievement for Omo. It is only team be say be share. Ayana the money think I can say only anything to lose. They come to enjoy themselves. Oshoma fine. One shoma, you know. So there's no pressure on them. Already they are in a mood of celebration. Say I mean, this is the farthest any Norwegian club has ever gotten to.
Of course.
So for them, it's like winning the Champions League.
And I'm sure that at this stage, you know, no team would end up under it. No. It almost today you come prepared.
Yeah.
ABI in the past, they starting another month for winning Comoswa. Domdia Man City. Domdia Inter Milan. Domdia Atletico Madrid. No. Many so say any team be Bishia, Esa Budufona, Obanda Rituomo. It you know, level no more Drunidia. Chama, they should come prepared. But I think that the Omayano, any position no money any Chama, Yana me pay underdogs for story, no. Yana India. And now a year excitement, free tournament in so I would like the underdog story to continue. Etibudo I wish Senkabudo for the qualify to the next stage of the competition. But we wait to see. Barca ball against a Newcastle. Newcastle able for first. Say any Newcastle ball this year Champions League. Go back here. And then the Newcastle forecast say Omumbo team bia or annoying like Barcelona because Barca ma bo ni bi more. So Barca any Newcastle CIA the league phase Emma Barcelona could win the game no. I think that will buy 2-1 or there and then show Musa game now. Ya show keke ya bomo ma Newcastle for no frustrated. Na Newcastle for no playoff no kobo ye no. Chairman they qualify by the first leg no. And be disappointed second leg no. Chairman obi anim say second leg ni there. O ka say under 4.5.